good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Wood from Proceed. Just a little intro to me. I am the regional lead for the Nordics region for Proceed, and I look after all customers and partners within the region on behalf of Proceed. So myself's on the webinar today, Paul Wood, and then also I've got my colleague Chris Burfitt, who will be delivering the main part of this webinar. If we could go on to the next slide, please. Yeah, just a brief agenda in terms of what we're going to be talking about today. So I'll just do a really short intro into Proceed and who we are and what we do within the marketplace. And then just a little bit of about our customers and who we've dealt with, etc., just to give you a bit of a flavour of who we deal with. And then I'll hand over to my colleague Chris, who will be going into around data legislation for SAP data. But what we want to try and impress on you today is to give you some sort of knowledge around SAP data compliance and data compliance in general from GDPR, etc., to ensure that you get to the point of being fined by the compliance that's out there. So if we could go on to the next slide, please, Chris. So a little bit about Proceed. So we are seen in the marketplace as experts in data management. So that comprises of archiving, decommissioning, and content management. So predominantly we deal with SAP enterprise users that have got large SAP estates, both on ERP and also HR systems. We have been in business for over 20 years now, and we have 14 offices worldwide, and we've actually completed over 700 plus customer projects, all centered around SAP data management and predominantly around SAP ILM, which is Information Lifecycle Management, which is the tool that you'll predominantly use to archive SAP data. We're SAP Gold partners, so we're actually SAP service Gold partners. We don't actually resell software on behalf of SAP, but what we do is regularly help SAP in software transactions, predominantly around ILM PCE, SAP IQ, etc. We have a global master services agreement in place with SAP, which means that we work on behalf of SAP into their customers, and we probably do around 30% of our business on SAP paper. We're actually very strategic to SAP, and as such that we have more ILM consultants than SAP globally. And because of that fact, SAP use Proceed and our consultants quite a lot. We've actually taken over 100 plus customers to SAP HANA. So we're always at the start, or tend to be at the start of an S4 journey to get the data estate prepped in preparation for the move to S4, whether that's greenfield or brownfield migration. Through our services, we've saved customers over £150 million along the way, because if you can attribute, decommissioning an SAP system that has cost associated to it, decommission the data that the customer needs for the life cycle of data for regulatory purposes, finance data, i.e. 7 years, and give the customer the ability to report on that data, we've actually saved significant amount of money for our customers. So we have lots of partnerships out there, and there's just a few on the slide. So obviously SAP is quite strategic, I've just mentioned that. We're also partners of OpenText, and we have OpenText skills, and they complement our SAP data management skills, in as much that obviously content store solutions are with OpenText are something that are very familiar to us, i.e. vendor invoice management, to name one. We've also got partnerships with all the hyperscalers, And we actually help customers move SAP workloads into all the major hyperscalers as well. So if it's something that you're thinking about, not just with GDPR compliance that we're going to be talking about today, but looking to do some form of archiving or decommissioning, then please reach out. Next slide, please, Chris. So here you'll see just a small amount actually of our customers. We're not industry specific. We have references and customers in all industries. And through the 20 years that we've been in business and been data management experts, we've built quite a big repository in terms of retention rules and policies that each industry should really adhere to. One of the customers that we're going to talk about at the end of this session is Telia. Telia are the major telecoms provider in the Nordics and Baltics region, and we actually undertook a GDPR project for them. But we can go into more detail once Chris has gone into the main body, completes the main body of the webinar. But again, you can see very big blue chip companies, all with very large SAP enterprise systems in place. So again, if there's something you would like to talk about, then please reach out. What I'll do now is hand over to Chris, let him introduce himself, and then go through the content. And again, hopefully give you some information around how you probably should run a data compliance project. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, good afternoon. I'm Chris Burfitt. I joined Proceed just over a year ago now. My background is in HR or HCM implementations in SAP. I've been doing that for over 20 years. You know, in about 2015, started to work with the ILM solution. So, and then in 2018, became quite pivotal in the organization I was working with at the time in data privacy compliance. We will predominantly be talking about GDPR in this webinar. It's an area. I'm based in the UK. It's the data privacy laws I know most about, but we are absolutely aware that all countries around the world have their own versions, obviously, of the data privacy regulations, and we're used to working with various different countries in the world, and know that that those rules are going to be different in different countries. So there is a few references to GDPR in this presentation. Equally, my examples are usually HCM data, because that's my background. However, equally applicable to customers, vendors, and business partners, which is where we also find that there is a data privacy compliance need. So to start, what we commonly find when we go into a customer is there is a tendency to jump in straight away and try and solve the data problem without understanding the wider context of the problem. And because of that, that can really derail a project. So one of the things that we absolutely recommend is a really good and detailed discovery phase, using that SAP Activate type terminology. So really understand what it is the problem that you're trying to solve. And that sounds a bit silly. You go, well, we're trying to solve GDPR, we're trying to solve data compliance, we're trying to be compliant. There's the problem. But what we find with customers is that that's not well enough defined in a lot of cases. And you say, well, okay, what actually is the problem you're trying to solve? The detail of it. You know, how long do you need to keep data for? What are you keeping the data for? And who is using the data? Is questions that organizations are struggling to answer. What they're also struggling to answer is about how much the problem is costing, and what cost benefit is for the project. What's the business case for the project? Who are the sponsors? In the end, the data compliance project is going to cost money. However, if you get these projects right, you can offset the cost of a compliance project with the benefit you get in your system. So understanding the wider context, understand what's going on in the organization. You know, are other people trying to solve that problem somewhere else as well, in other systems? There may be other systems out there. Well, there will be other systems out there holding this type of data, and that someone maybe is already trying to address this problem and has the answers. So try to understand that wider context is our experience, and it's a good foundation. Once you've understood that context, it's then there are several other things that can also then derail the project. And to be honest, these are common throughout any sort of IT project, so there shouldn't really be any surprises here on this slide. However, they're here because we still find that these are the problems we have when we engage. We find that the users don't understand the issues and what you're trying to achieve. Particularly, users are generally used to the data being there for us forever. They're not used to data being removed at a certain point in time, so they've never thought about how long they need the data for. Now that becomes a bit of a shock when you tell a user, no, we are going to remove the data, and then you say, well, when should we remove it? And they can't give you the answer. The resource requirements are really important. These projects are multidiscipline, and we'll come on to the stakeholders in a minute in one of the next slides. But if you haven't engaged a range of stakeholders, that will also derail your project. This is about the people who own the data, the people who use the data compliance officers, people in the legal department, people setting policy. All of these people are going to be interested in what happens to data, and quite often the view about what to do with that data is different amongst those different stakeholders, which is why it's really important to get those right. Success criteria sound simple, but if you don't have a defined success criteria and outcome, that can cause you a lot of problems. The constraints, clearly from a data compliance point of view, are important. You know, you're going to have industry-specific policies, legislation. There's technology constraints, things that SAP doesn't do as standard. They're all important. And at the end of that, it's a very good idea then to come up with this discovery report, and everybody then knows what the project is about, and you have that firm foundation. So let's come on to these key stakeholders. Quite often in a project, they're very much IT-led in a data compliance project, or conversely, you can get projects that are compliance-led. The problem is it's usually one or the other, we find. And if you're an IT-led project, maybe you haven't engaged the data governance and data protection teams and the legal side of things. If it's a legal compliance project, sometimes they haven't engaged the data owners or the people who look after the system, those functional consultants, key super users, network administrators. So there are a whole set of people who use the system for different things, who have interests in different types of data. They need data for different purposes, and getting all of these people involved is absolutely critical to the project. What we have found is it's quite common for organizations to, for instance, consider data from a usage point of view on a day-to-day transactional basis, but maybe they haven't engaged the reporting users, the people who are doing the analytics, the people who are using BW to run reports, people who are using data in non-SAP systems where you've extracted the data maybe to some sort of information warehouse. And that is a critical engagement. All of these stakeholders, we would recommend these types of people are involved. in order to make sure that you've got all of those viewpoints and you don't end up with a nasty shock halfway through the project where you find that actually someone comes to you and says, no, actually we're still using that data. We don't want you to remove it. So that's a critical thing. So we'll come on to, we've done the discovery phase. You know what your project's about. You've identified those key stakeholders and you've briefed them on the project. Why are you doing the project? So this is where we come on to some approaches. Now, clearly, SAP Activate is something that we will, we reference during an implementation. Everybody has different terms for the steps that we go through, but broadly, for any project, regardless of whether it's a data compliance project, we have these stages. So as we've discussed, that discover phase, absolutely critical to getting the foundation of the project on a solid foundation. Then, assuming we've done that discovery phase and that's all gone well, we can move on to the design phase. Then, of course, we get that design signed off. We're moving into implementation. Testing on any IT project, I'm sure everybody is on board with that, is absolutely critical. Although a lot of the products that we're going to talk about are SAP standard, it doesn't mean that they don't have bugs, and it doesn't mean that they maybe in a configuration point of view could not have something that isn't working as the requirement. Stabilization and operating. From a data compliance point of view, often this is the stage where we're removing data that actually really should have been removed earlier. Maybe we've got some compliance rules that say data after 7 years should be removed from the system. Clearly, there's already data in the system that probably is over that age. So we have a sort of catch-up type exercise, a stabilization phase, and then we have a business as usual run phase. Specifically for ILM, so information lifecycle management, this is our area, one of our areas of expertise is Proceed. We pretty much do everything in the ILM toolset. And when we're doing that, we're doing blocking, we're doing archiving, we're doing data destruction. Now, on the detail level, we are doing quite a lot of things in terms of ILM. Quite often, we have to apply a lot of notes. The data privacy functionality within SAP has developed significantly over the last 4 years. Customers, we often find customers need a lot of patching or notes in order to use the functionality. So that's definitely something that really has to be called out. Don't assume that you can just switch it on and it'll work. There are notes that aren't included in patches as well. So sometimes we'll find even a customer who is bang up to date with patches that we still have to apply manually apply notes. We have some business functions for ILM. Again, it's not activated as standard in your system. You have to go into those business functions and switch it on. And there are a number of different switches in there, including industry-specific ILM functions, specifically to do with data protection and checking what we call end of purpose. End of purpose we'll come on to in the next few slides, and what that means from both a compliance point of view, a sort of data protection GDPR point of view, and what it means in SAP, which is ever so slightly different in SAP. Obviously, then we've got that implementation step where we build and test the solution, and then we have we'll come on to again about blocking data. We also have a separate thing which isn't archiving or deletion, but rather that we keep the data in the system, but we put some extra authorization controls on it to block it. So what's critical for us is the analysis phase in an ILM project, and actually you can broaden this out to GDPR and or data protection functionality in general. So we'll This slide talks about the information lifecycle management, but we will also have a little touch on things like UI masking, UI logging, things like restrictions on who can download data from the system. All of those require an analysis phase. This particular slide, again, is something that we do on commonly on for our customers. Is we're looking at information lifecycle management. We're going into your system, looking at the types of data in the system, looking at the business processes, applying those notes, and getting rules from you according to compliance or according to data usage as to how long data should be in the live system, how long it should be in an archive, or whether you can just destroy data. The key deliverables here, like in most projects, you would have some sort of design document, blueprint, solution document, whatever you choose to call it in your organization. There would be some mapping against business processes. Where in the process are we touching data, and what happens if we archive or remove that data? At what point can that data be removed because it's no longer required? It's beyond the purpose that you collected it for. And then clearly project planning is critical to get a project to be successful. So one of the important questions we get asked quite a lot is about SAP information lifecycle management, and actually we'll come on to this for certain other things like UI masking and UI logging as well. Is there an extra cost when you come to do data compliance? Now, the answer is sometimes. SAP have provided tools which they consider will make you GDPR compliant or data protection compliant in other countries. There is a lot of country-specific functionality in there. If you go searching around in the solution, you will find specific items for India, for the US, for Indonesia, for Japan. There's an awful lot of functionality in the system that is there and free to use to remove, generally speaking, to either delete, block, or archive data that is personally identifiable information, i.e. this data could be a person and we can identify something about that person from the data, and therefore it's covered by that data privacy legislation. The important thing is as soon as you start touching data that isn't PII, then that's no longer free. There is an ILM license, and as soon as we start going broader in terms of the data set into data that's not personal data. So let's take a vendor, for instance. This is often where we get into some interesting conversations. A vendor may be an organization, but it could also be a person. If all of your vendors are actually organizations and none of them are people, that's not PII data, it's not free. If some of your vendors are personally identifiable, that's when it starts to come into the possibility of being a free license. And we have to get into a discussion if there's a mix of the two data. We talk about that and try and work out whether we are free or fee. So what is definitely a fee is where you want to expand it to other data types, where we want to use it for decommissioning, or where there's policies that are outside of data compliance for privacy purposes. And the fee also allows you to use a tool called SAP IQ, which is a database for with a data storage for archiving information, whereas the free version does not come with a storage option. So let's come on to some of the services that SAP offers. But before we do, some information which I'm sure everybody on this call, certainly from the EU or from UK, will be familiar with. These principles of data protection are pretty much standard across the world, to be honest. These are the GDPR, the EU versions, but when we look at the legislation in other countries, we find some very similar principles. So firstly, purpose limitation. You must be clear about why you collect the data, and you must tell people that you've collected data and why you collected it. One of the reasons for fines in this area is collecting data and not telling people why you collected it, or using it for a purpose that you didn't state and tell them about. Once you've completed the purpose, you should be restricting access to that data or removing it. The second item is around minimization. So again, this is a GDPR example, but applicable across the world. You shouldn't store more data than you need. It's got to be relevant, and it's got to be limited to what's necessary. Any data that you don't have a reason for keeping, you can't just keep it just in case. You must state why you've kept it, and if you haven't got a reason, you can't justify it. You need to get rid of it. And then the final one, again, GDPR, but common across the world, is that similar to the minimization, is a storage limitation. So it's not just around only collecting data, the minimum amount of data, but this is now about you collected the data, but you need to get rid of it because you don't need it any longer. Again, if you don't have a reason for keeping it, then you need to remove it, and this is where we get into retention periods and anonymization and things like that. So quite often what we'll do is we'll talk to customers about their data, and it's sometimes quite difficult to understand what are the stages of the data lifecycle. So we use a thermometer, a temperature gauge. And what we do is we'll talk to customers and we'll say, okay, well, let's think of this data in terms of how hot it is. The hottest data is that live data, business critical, used day to day. Then we get the temperature is cooling a little bit. It's data that is still needed, but it's infrequently used. And then we get the stone cold data, which is actually meaningless and really should be removed. So in terms of what we do with the data, if it's live, if it's business critical, if it's hot, you will keep it in live. There is still some opportunity to mask or block. You certainly will be using, I'm sure, SAP authorizations to restrict access to only key users, but generally speaking, you're not using the data protection tools in this context. Where we start using the data protection tool set is in the middle one, which is where it's starting to get a bit cooler. And this is where we start to archive, mask, block. And then data that is meaningless, technical data quite often in logs and buffers, it can be removed. It can be some personal data that's in transactional type data that has been moved into like from a CATS timesheet, the cross-application timesheet. It's been processed and it's been moved over. Once it's been moved, it's then redundant, and you can consider destroying it. So the hot data, generally people want it at their fingertips. They want it high speed. They want it there as soon as they ask for it. Where it's getting a bit cooler, this is where you can consider, if you're an S4HANA, you can put it into the sort of the aged data. If you're not in an S4HANA system, you would look at archiving. And then the cold data is where we look at deleting and housekeeping. And then the actions, the sort of actions that we do, as it says there, sort of in-memory type stuff for the hot data, smart storage for the warm data, and then housekeeping and ILM for removing data once it gets cold. So in terms of SAP, in terms of the tool set, we've got the business as usual processing. In this case, as we've said, you will be using SAP authorizations already, I'm sure. There are data access restrictions because of that. You know, I'm not a finance user, I don't get to see finance data. I'm not an HR user, I don't get to see HR data. Perhaps I only have access to a particular organization entity. There is also an opportunity for UI masking. We'll come on to that. That's an extra add-on and an extra license cost, but that is a possibility even at that stage. Then we get into the restricted use processing. This is where we can start thinking about blocking data. And blocking, it can be either the blocking solution from SAP, or it could be archiving. So transactional data, that's how we block archive data, because you need special authorizations to access the archive. So one thing to say about blocking, you can only block when all of the transactional data is business complete, and that causes quite a lot of pain for customers, and we will come on to that a little bit later, and I think Paul will talk about that for Telia as well. And then we get to end of purpose, and this is where SAP has provided a lot of tools in the ILM toolset, which is around data purge and data destruction. There is a specific solutions also for some of the cloud products like SuccessFactors. That there's a data purge solution for SuccessFactors, for instance. So this is, but in this presentation, we're going to concentrate on the sort of on-prem S4 HANA type system. We're not going to talk about sort of Ariba or SuccessFactors or Fieldglass, but they do have their own data purge tool sets. So what is end of purpose? This is something that causes us a lot of pain when we're trying to set a project up and we're trying to come to an agreement on how long to keep data and when we come to advise a customer. So we're often asked, how long should we keep the data? And the answer is, well, we don't know, because it's dependent on the purpose you're using the data for. So in most data privacy laws, it will say that you should have stated the purpose for the data to the data subject. So that you should know why you've collected the data. What is difficult then to define for customers is, right, okay, we think we finished using the data, but we're not sure. And you go, well, why aren't you sure? And it's questions and answers come back like, well, we might need it for pension purposes. We might need it for a legal purpose. There is maybe a shell record that's needed for employee queries. This end of purpose is absolutely critical when doing data protection type purging and blocking and archiving, because once you get to the end of purpose, that's where the legal obligation steps in. And it says, well, you've now got no reason to keep this data, you should be removing it. So that end of purpose is absolutely critical. End of purpose from an SAP point of view is a little bit different in that there are specific end of purpose checks in the system, and those end of purpose checks tend to be checking whether things are complete. So let's just take a customer transaction, for instance, that's looking for transactional data under a customer, and whether that's been cleared or closed or marked as ready for archiving. But in the end, whether it's the SAP version or it's the legal version, the end of purpose is absolutely critical. So that end of purpose, and that can be have two different angles to it. And again, this is why the stakeholders are absolutely critical when you're making these decisions. You will find in some cases that you will have a legal requirement to keep data, and often this is it could be a financial reason. Maybe it's a financial document. It could be that there is a chance that you could have an employment law case that might come through in a particular time period. So in the UK, it's a 6-year statute of limitations that might be driving your requirement. However, in the example A, the organizational requirement is actually longer than that legal requirement. Now, I have a particular customer we're working with at the minute where their requirement is driven by their pension scheme and their pension provider, and they need to keep their employee data for much, much longer than is legally required because of pension queries. In example B, it might be that the organization says, well, we don't need it anymore. And in that case, this is something that will be fine. You talk to the person in the business, they say, no, we don't need that anymore, we don't report on it. Yeah, you can get rid of it. However, then you talk to the legal team and they go, no, you need to keep that because we might get audited. And there's a reason then that you need to keep the data for longer. So this is why those stakeholders are absolutely critical, because you're going to get different viewpoints depending on who you speak to. Another issue that we find is around the fact that even if SAP is your master system for data, it will be sending out data and communicating with different systems. So you can't really just consider the SAP core system. And this is where the situation is getting more and more complicated with the cloud landscape. So if you're a customer, for instance, who's implementing SuccessFactors, maybe your master system for employee data is SuccessFactors, but your master system for payroll is the ERP or ECC system. Maybe you're taking data out into a data warehouse, whether that be BW, workforce analytics in the cloud, their cloud analytics. There may be links to an SRM or a CRM system. Maybe you're using Ariba and you've got your finance system using the integration with Ariba. Testing systems, system copies, all of these things need to be considered where there is passing personally identifiable information between those systems. It's something that we will help advise on, but obviously we can't give you definitive answers on how to deal with the systems. Sometimes we have tools available to help us. So for ECC to BW, for instance, there's a thing called the Data Protection Tool Workbench, which can pass deletions and such like over to BW, but that's extra to what we normally do in ILM. But maybe you don't want to pass that deletion over, so we can't answer the question for you as to what you want to do in these systems. But we do help advise on this. But it's something to be you need to consider in a project. Where is that data linked to a system that's sending data in? Maybe it's time clocking system, a downstream system like a pension system, a reporting system, system copy training system, etc. So there's all of the background to what we need to know before we even start. And we need to know that foundation so that we can consider then, once we know what the requirement is, we know how long we're keeping the data for, we know what the purpose is, we know all the systems we're trying to treat, then we can start looking at the tool set. So what have we got in the box? We've got some UI masking for data. Two different solutions depending on whether you're on S/4HANA or not. It's an add-on. It is not free. This is there's a license cost for UI masking. So it's a lot easier to implement on S/4HANA. It's a much more simple solution than it is on a traditional ERP database, but it is available, and it means that you can mask data in reports, in the GUI, in WebDim Pro, UI5, in basically all of the user interfaces, and that can be masked on a field-by-field basis. Then we've got end of purpose checks for archiving and destruction. So the system is going to look to see whether data is complete, and it's going to then allow you to treat data based on whether that data is complete or not, and then you put what these then The next 2 points, the residency rules or retention rules. So we say we can, in some cases, say that data must remain in live for a particular period of time, not for all types of data, that has to be said. And then we can, for most types of data, say what the retention policy is, so we can control that data can't be destroyed before a particular period, but when it reaches that period, we can run a destruction routine to remove the data. That destruction in some cases is directly out of the database, like a lot of the HR data, or it can be after it was archived, so you can archive it and then destroy. We also have things like legal hold. Don't destroy or archive this particular record. That's on a case-by-case basis. Blocking, which is around introducing new authorization objects to say that only certain people can see data. And we also have a destruction veto where another system still needs the data. The blocking is particularly troublesome when we go into a customer, because you can only block data for customers, vendors, business partners when the underlying transactions are complete. And so we quite often have issues with data quality in that area, and it's not something to underestimate, because anything that's still open in an SAP context, SAP set those end of purpose checks. We don't set them. If SAP thinks the data is not complete, you can't block it. So this is our area of expertise, really. This is is our bread and butter. We use the ILM Information Lifecycle Manager, and we are basically looking at, it's an archiving tool in general, but in some cases the archiving can be used just to destroy data. So what SAP allows you to do is it will safely remove the data from the system. It checks everything has been removed without any orphans being left, without corrupting the database. It checks everything has worked correctly and didn't fall over halfway through. And if all of that has worked, it will allow you to archive it, or if you don't want to keep the archive file, or in HR, quite often we can't keep the archive file, it's just a destruction object. Even though it produces a file, that file is then just destroyed. There are different sets of archive files depending on retention rules, so we can set conditions to say for this country it's 7 years, for this other country it's 5 years, and then you can say also, as depending on what type of data it is, you might say company code specific retention rules, for instance, for finance data. The e-discovery, that's quite a nice piece of functionality, but it's being developed, still being developed quite a lot by SAP, but it's getting better. Basically goes and looks for an entity in the archive files and allows you to hold the data for that entity. So an employee, for instance, it goes and looks to see whether there are any archive files for payroll or time. For a customer, you might say it's an invoice, and it goes and looks to see where all of the archive files that relate to that customer or invoice. So that's quite a nice little tool, and that allows you to apply a hold on the data specific to that particular data. It means that you can set an overarching retention policy without thinking, yeah, but there will be exceptions. It's like, well, yeah, legal hold and e-discovery will allow you to manage those exceptions. Data interdependencies. I've used an HR example. As I mentioned earlier, my area of expertise is HR, but this slide, I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but what I wanted to demonstrate was that there are interconnections between data, which mean that when you come to, for instance, go to archive time evaluation and payroll for an HR a record, using an example for a customer, you would if you try to block or archive a customer, all of the boxes above would be to do with all of those customer transactions and all the data that can happen for a customer. But in this case, it's an HR object, and you can see that there's all of this types of data. We've got different ways the data has been collected, and they're sitting in different databases. Because of the way the data is collected, it's then transferred into a target component. So let's say it's the timesheet. See, that's cross application. That can take project system information, finance information, such like into the target application. We need to treat that original data and that data interface. We've got the variable data, sort of transactional data, and then we've got various different types of master data, and we've got processing data that where we're in time evaluation and payroll, where we took all of that master data, we did some sort of processing, we got some sort of results. And then that final one at the bottom, where we've moved data from one place to another. In this case, it's a payroll posting. We've taken the information from payroll, and we've given the finance component some information. Obviously, that can happen in other circumstances as well, where we're transferring information from one component to another. So complex situation. It's you have to treat all of the dependent data before you can look at the end point of treating the other objects. Another slide that I'm not going to go into in great detail, but this is really just to show you, certainly from an archiving and destruction point of view, that it's a very complex picture. There isn't one type of process. As you can see here, there are 6 different types of process that we've got across the system. Some involves some pre-processing, so you can't run just the right program to take the data and to move it into the archive. You have to check that it can be archived. Different types of pre-processing depending on whether it's HR data or not. And then we've got some objects that are destruction only. Some that have most have end of purpose checks, as you can see there. Some can go into the archive. And then the important point is they'll all have this ILM retention rule, which stops any destruction before the organization is ready for it to be destroyed. So that's the overarching message for ILM, and that's really the biggest benefit of ILM is these overarching rules that you can set against all types of data to say, yeah, this will protect the data being removed until it has reached the end of its life. This gets a little bit technical, and I'll apologize for that, but it's a question that we quite often get from customers, is around, well, how does it know when to destroy data or archive it for that matter? And this is where we get into the complexities of the ILM solution. And what I've tried to do in this diagram is, and the next slide is just to show you a couple of different options. This isn't the only 2 options, but it's 2 examples of how we can determine whether data is ready to be destroyed and how we might do that. So in this particular item, we firstly start out with a condition field. So in this case, we've said, is the item that we're looking at, is it active or inactive? Now that condition field could also be something like a company code. What company code is it? Or it could be a country. Which country are we in? So basically we're applying a condition field to say, depending on what I find, I'm going to do 2 different things. Now, in this particular circumstance, we're looking at a status. It says, is the status inactive? If it's not inactive, in this particular case, we're not going to do anything with it. We say it's still active. We need it. There's no reason to remove it. But if it's inactive, that's when we're going to, in this particular case, we're going to look at the end of record. But that could be also when it changed of status. So we could say, what date did the record change from being in process to being complete or being cancelled? What date was that? But in this case, we've said end of record. And we've said 7 years from the end of record, we're going to remove the data. So we look at the current date, we work back 7 years. If we find data that's over 7 years old, we remove it. In this second example, what we're doing on this one is we are looking at an indirect rule. So it's not the actual data object we're looking at something else. So in the case of an employee, we look at whether the person has left or not. And in case of a customer, it might be whether that customer is active and at what point in time was the last transaction done for the customer. Now, This particular setup is also using a condition field, still saying, is the person active? Are they inactive? Is the customer active? Is it inactive? If it's active, we're not going to do anything. If it's inactive, we're going to look at the retention rule. The difference here is we're saying that if the customer has been inactive for 7 years, we're going to remove all of the data, and the underlying data, we're not going to care how old it is. We're going to remove it, and that's quite a critical difference than the one earlier. So in this case, we're only removing data that's over 7 years old based on the actual data record. In this one, we're saying what we're going to do is look at the status. How long is it since that status was the case? And actually, then we're going to remove everything. This second example is quite often used in an employee context. Employee left 7 years ago, right, we're going to remove all of the data. So what we also get asked about is data breaches. So the ILM solution is predominantly concentrated on those principles of purpose, of minimization, of relevancy, and making sure you're only holding data that's relevant. However, on a data breach, that's slightly different, because that's not about whether the data is relevant or not. That's about the data definitely is relevant. It should be in your system, but you want to make it as difficult as possible for that data to be accidentally lost or even deliberately lost or misused. So we don't have anything particularly in the box from ILM around data breaches, but what we do have in SAP context is some tools in the box that can help you reduce the chance of a data breach. Now, the most common reason for a data breach is where data has been moved out of the secure database into some other data store, and where that other data store is not as tightly controlled. Now, in an SAP context, we can't control that other data store. We can't do anything about how someone stores their data in an Excel spreadsheet or on in a file, in a Word file or whatever. What we can do is apply some restrictions in the technical level of the system to make it more difficult to remove data from the system and more difficult to see data at a database level. So what we quite often find is we go into a customer and we find that there's quite wide access to transactions that allow you access at a table level, like SE16 or SE16N. Restrictions are available in SAP for those types of transactions, and even down to a table level, which will allow you to allow access to maybe non-personal data tables, but not to other types of tables. There are also ways of restricting who can download data. So obviously you can see it's that thing that, save to file, really nice little feature in SAP. However, the problem is if someone saved personal data to file, you've lost control of it. And the final thing is around the security and authorization model, and ensuring that actually only people who are allowed to see the data have access to the data. Quite often we find, particularly with quite mature customers, is that the security and authorizations model is maybe not as tightly controlled as it needs to be. And that is always worth a review. And then we've got a few things on the list we'll come on to, which is around UI masking and UI logging, which are also quite useful in terms of seeing who's been accessing data and restricting access to data. So UI logging, this is an additional license cost. It's an add-on, but it is something that customers are increasingly looking at because in this particular example, it's a really good example because the HR data, there is nothing that's recorded in the system when someone looks at HR data. It records when there's a change to an info type, but the standard, it doesn't say who viewed it. Now, if you want to be certain that only the people viewing the data are for the right reasons, and you want to be sure, you want to be able to audit who was looking at what, then UI logging might be the answer. It's a very technical solution, as you can see on the right-hand side. It's not for the faint-hearted. However, it is definitely a very powerful tool, and allows you then to say, okay, we can see someone accessed this data record, we can see someone looked at this basic pay record. Let's track that back to a customer interaction with the employee, or a ticket. Hold on a second, there was no ticket. Why has this user accessed this record? And then you could follow up on that and try and work out what was the reason for the viewing of the record. So that's a very powerful tool. It is available across other types of transactions. Obviously, it's not just HCM. But takes up database space for the logs, and as you can see, is complex to interpret the results. So not something that we would usually recommend for customers, but could be the solution that you need if you want to track exactly who's seen what and when. Masking, we had a little chat about this in the earlier slides. You can see an example here on the left-hand side. In this particular case, we can see that there's a basic pay record for an employee, but masking is across. We've got a material example down there on the left-hand side as well. So you can make it so that certain values are masked, and that you can not see certain data. You can see the record exists, you can see certain key information about the record, but you can't see that the specific values. For an employee, for instance, you could mask the date of birth, you could mask the basic pay, maybe you would mask their address. There are ways of requesting. There is a request mechanism if the user needs to see the data, and that's logged. So you can say, yeah, they requested unmasking. You can see that in the log. You see it happened, and then it will automatically remask it after that has been completed. So it's a nice way of tracking who's done what without having to do all of that detailed logging. So this UI logging is extremely complicated. It's actually much easier to mask the fields and track it through unmasking requests.
Chris, sorry to interject. We've got 1 minute left before the end of the webinar, so I'll just really quickly run through Telia. So the reason why Telia started this GDPR project, it was all around blocking, was because their audit partner basically highlighted the risk. Proceed engaged, we gave them some free time to choose the right solution and the right way to go about it. And what I will say is that we're happy to do that with people on the call, so please reach out. Just some real quick lessons learned from that project. Align internally, i.e. the stakeholders are quite key. Plan correctly, and then the open transactions, which Chris has alluded to, the business complete data that's then enabled to go archiving. Lovely. Thanks ever so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Give me a call or reach out to me if you want to have a discussion on any of your points raised. Thank you very much.